Eli Lake, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So I have listened to you with interest over the past couple of weeks unpack for a number of different folks and on your own podcast the happenings that went down in Mar-a-Lago and some of the things that you took away from the experience of paying attention to everything that the FBI has been doing in recent years from, let's say, a skeptical perspective in terms of the messaging that they've been handing out. And I wanted to give our listeners a chance to hear your take on all of that. Let me maybe step back for a moment and just sort of get your perspective on this. As someone who, sort of has covered not just the intelligence community, but the law enforcement community from a number of different perspectives over the years, was there a certain point where you started to feel like things had shifted in the FBI, where perhaps some of the critiques that were being lodged against them were no longer coming from the realm of conspiracy, but perhaps were something that needed to be taken a little more seriously when it came to accusations of partisanship or the like?
Well, for me, I think that would be, which might be an obscure story, but I think is a very important one. It has to do with what was sometimes known shorthand as the Nunes memo, which was the memo of the former Republican chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Devin Nunes. And it was specifically about the evidence presented to a secret surveillance court known as the FISA court by the FBI to obtain a warrant and then 3 subsequent renewals of a warrant to surveil Carter Page. Now, the first 2.5, maybe even 3 years of the Trump administration, you had a, sort of drumbeat of stories about Carter Page where he was basically being accused of being a spy. When it was leaked, when it was determined that there was a surveillance warrant for his communications, that was taken as further confirmation of it. Now, in the world of intelligence and reporting on intelligence, there's going to be bum steers. There's going to be bad info. Oftentimes you have to rely on anonymous sources. And, as James Jesus Angleton once said, it is a kind of a wilderness of mirrors. And you have to, it's a tougher beat than other things. However, there was such pushback, not just from the Democrats, but from the FBI itself, that Nunes was simultaneously in this memo that he sought the declassification of going to gravely injure national security, harm American national security, but also that he was cherry-picking information and presenting a false impression. Because what Nunes, at the end of the day, the central claim of what he said was that the FBI used unvetted opposition research that was generated by the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016 to get a secret court to approve the kind of surveillance, the technical spying on a former advisor of Donald Trump's campaign, which is, in my view, a devastating and serious charge. But what you had at that moment was the FBI itself saying, this is all wrong. And then you sort of saw at that time, if you remember, this is like in early 2019, and it was also in 2018, where there were a number of former officials who have a lot of credibility, especially in the mainstream media, who were then backing up this as saying, this is so dangerous, it's so wrong, Nunes is an idiot, it's so dishonest, and they were just taking this line. And then we find out at the end of 2019, because of the Justice Department's Inspector General Michael Horowitz, that not only was Nunes right, it was worse than we thought, that the FBI not only used this, what's known as the Steele dossier, which we can talk about, to get the warrant, but they also had information. They interviewed his subsource, who then disavowed a lot of the claims that showed that there were a lot of problems with it, and continued to submit the original dossier as evidence for the renewal of that surveillance warrant. Which, if you think about, so there's two things. One is that Nunes was right, that they used partisan opposition research, kind of entered into this, what is supposed to be an independent, insulated from political process of the FBI to spy on somebody who was in the Trump campaign. And because of the way these things work, you could get access to other people who were in the Trump campaign. It's a complicated thing we don't have to get into. But then they had put up a smoke screen, a kind of, they lied, when this was a political showdown about declassifying the original memo. And, I have come to expect people like Adam Schiff, the current chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, to be dishonest and, complete partisan hack. But I was really surprised that Christopher Wray's FBI would be doing that as well. Mm-hmm. So that for me was a moment. And then if you read the entire Horowitz report, it's not just about the mistakes that they made in the FISA court. It's they had extraordinarily intrusive tactics they used against the Trump campaign for what I still think is, he clears them for the opening of the original investigation. It's a technical thing, but they still decided to use confidential informants, basically running spies against, their targeted individuals. And for what? And that this allegation was kept open. So that was the Horowitz report. I mean, I was always skeptical. I mean, I wrote originally that I thought that the circumstances of the firing of Michael Flynn were dodgy. I was always not necessarily with the pack on it, but it was that Inspector General's report that I would say really kind of put me into the camp of I'm not going to believe it until I don't just take everything you say as I don't trust everything you say off the bat. So that's probably what it was.
I want to have you work your thoughts for a moment.
Yeah.
When was the first time that you heard something just in the course of covering politics and the 2016 Trump campaign? When was the first time that you heard something that later showed up or was featured as an aspect of the Steele dossier?
So you mean like when did I hear a rumor of something and then I saw it later?
A piece of gossip and then later found out, oh, this is part of that.
Well, I mean, I was against Trump in 2016 as a columnist, and I had written stories that I still stand. I'd written a column I still stand by about Paul Manafort called "Trump Just Hired His Next Scandal," which has been totally borne out. But what's interesting, I'll tell you, this is very interesting, Ben. All the stuff about Manafort, which was true and well known, I had covered Manafort earlier. Manafort was involved in...
He was a known quantity, man. I was there. I was in the green room on Fox News Sunday the day that he started, like his first media appearance as the campaign head. So yeah, I know. He was a known
quantity, and he was known to represent the deposed president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. He was very close with Yanukovych, and that was known before Maidan Square in 2014. And I had covered this because I, cover foreign affairs and stuff like that. So I'd known who Manafort was. And then, he has a rap sheet that goes back to the 80s, and you can find all that. So that column was right. But here's the interesting thing. None of the stuff that was true about Manafort was in the Steele dossier. Well, that's interesting. Why? Mm-hmm. Well, it's because the people who put together the Steele dossier, Fusion GPS, and Christopher Steele, the former MI6 agent, had been working for a Russian oligarch named Oleg Deripaska, who was basically using their research skills or whatever they are selling to get money back that Paul Manafort had owed Deripaska. And all of this, by the way, is in a much cited report from the Senate Intelligence Committee. It's their 5th volume on this, and resistance types will always cite elements of this report, but they never get around to the section on who the people were actually working for. So just to sort of give it another kind of wrinkle on this, if you remember in 2017, a huge story was this Trump Tower meeting with a lawyer named Natalia Veselnitskaya. It was the biggest thing in the world. There's a whole lot of elements of it. Trump dictates a press release, which turns out to be, false, and everybody's like, this is it, the walls are closing in, yada, yada, yada. Okay, Natalia Veselnitskaya had a far more substantial relationship. She had a 30-minute meeting with Jared Kushner and who else? Jared Kushner and Manafort and other people in the campaign in like June of 2016. She had a 2 or 3 year working relation where she paid Fusion GPS. These are the people that put together the opposition research dossier known as the Steele dossier for the Clinton campaign. She was literally working with them. She was a client of Fusion GPS who basically were lobbying in Washington, part of an information campaign to roll back these sanctions known as the Magnitsky sanctions, which were, going after senior Russian officials for ostensibly for lots of human rights violations, but initially the murder of this lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky. Now, I bring all of this up because that was the part of the story that was always missing at the time, which is that both campaigns kind of had these weird connections to Russia, if you really wanted to do that, and the standard of kind of going after Trump was never applied to Clinton. And we now are finding out more of it because of people like John Durham. There's a special counsel, but that sort of stuff I was on my radar at the time. I was like, well, wait a second. I mean, even if you go back to Manafort shared a contract to lobby for Yanukovych that was not registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, a law that was not criminally enforced until the Trump years, but then was turned around by Andrew Weissman, who was one of the lawyers on the Mueller team, to squeeze people to turn them into cooperating witnesses against, ultimately, I would imagine, Trump. So instead, what they did is they filed in something called the Lobbying Disclosure Act. And I know this sounds a little bit far afield, but believe me, it's very relevant because it shows this sort of double standard, which I think drives us both nuts. Okay, so Manafort had shared the lobbying contract for Yanukovych, which technically ran afoul of the Foreign Agents Law, with Tony Podesta, the brother of John Podesta, and his lobbying shop. Now, they were investigated, and ultimately the Podesta group had to shut down, but he was never charged. He was never anything like that. Now, there was one Democrat, Greg Craig, who was prosecuted. The government lost that case. But mainly, the attention was against the Republicans. They threatened Mike Flynn with FARA. They threatened, Rick Gates. They threatened Manafort. But what about the more establishment Republicans who also shared it with Mercury Group like Vin Weber? So I say, if you're going to go after this stuff, you have to do it consistently. And so that was like another element of it. I'm like, well, okay, you're only going to prosecute, by the way, you're only going to prosecute the Foreign Agents Registration Law, which no one had prosecuted for like 40 years, at least criminally. And you're only going to do it against people who are in and around Trump. Now, that might make sense if you looked at the Trump investigation the way that you would look at, say, the investigation of La Cosa Nostra's 5 families, right? So we're going to get them on anything we can in order to flip witnesses, and we're going to flip the capos so we finally get to the Godfather. But this is a guy who was just elected the president of the United States. So you're treating the president as if he is a mob boss that was effectively based on the thinnest of rumors and opposition research or whatever that you thought he might have colluded with Russia, which, by the way, they never proved. And that really held his presidency hostage for the first 2.5 years. And I think is the reason why, and I try to be pretty measured about this because I am not calling for the abolition of the FBI or defunding the FBI, but I think it's why there are probably millions of American conservatives and Republicans who think, to hell with it, let's start again,
Yeah. Well, I think part of that too is that they haven't been offered any alternative. There's no reform measure. There's no, the idea of a church commission is something that not a lot of people even understand. And I do want to ask you about that kind of solution-based approach. But one thing before we get to that is you bring up a very interesting point in the sense that they were treating the recently elected president of the United States, as if he was the head of a mob family where they needed to use everything that they possibly could, the equivalent of parking ticket violations and that kind of thing against lower level people in order to make them flip. And, to me, that aspect of desperation was something that, as someone close to DC, who has, awareness of FARA, as awareness of sort of the way that these lobbying shops work, awareness of kind of the way that the internal conflicts of people working at odds or even in tandem on various contracts. The whole thing seemed to me to be almost a joke. Like, this is ridiculous. Are you actually going to use all of this as justification for, an enormous amount of spying on people at the highest levels of a recently elected government? The whole thing seemed to me on its surface to be kind of like, I can't believe they would actually do this. And then to discover, both through the memo and that you mentioned and others, reporting as well, that yes, this is actually what they were doing. It was very disturbing to me, and really, shook a lot of my faith in the kind of institutions that I think that we need to be able to have faith in as protecting us. So for Americans across the country, whether they're seriously engaged in this story or not, is there a path back to restoring that kind of institutional trust? Because if there isn't, then I can understand why they would basically say, burn the whole place down.
Okay, so that's a very good question. There is kind of a way back. It's like, that's why we have inspectors general. When they find really bad stuff, they get it out there. And it should have been a major political scandal, except it wasn't a political scandal because the Democrats had moved on to the first impeachment, which was about the phone call on Ukraine. And I have to say, I'm not rationalizing that. I thought what the president's behavior in that phone call was pretty awful. Didn't think it necessarily met the bar of impeachment, and I didn't think that the Democrats pursued impeachment in a way that was aimed at persuadable Republicans, which would have been the kind of which would have been in keeping with the Constitution of it. But I'm just saying that we didn't have a moment after that original Horowitz report that would have maybe sort of convinced, I don't know, the sort of elite legal establishment, the political establishment, that there was a huge overreach and that there were huge problems and that this needed to be corrected. Instead, it's been a kind of cover-up mode. So the one of the guys who was prosecuted ultimately pleaded guilty in the FISA debacle having to do with Carter Page is someone named Kevin Kleinsmith. He's an FBI lawyer who altered evidence when the CIA said that Page had been a helpful kind of point of contact for them. He changed it to say that no, the CIA doesn't know who this guy is. So basically, those little edits were enough to change the actual meaning of, to say the opposite of what was true. Well, he got probation, and the District of Columbia bar just reinstated him in good standing. So he is able to practice law still, even though he defrauded, along with lots of other people at the FBI and who were involved in this FISA warrant, defrauded the secret FISA court. And that's in some ways even worse than defrauding a normal court, because it has to be secret, because this is what grants these surveillance warrants, which you can't have an opposing counsel for. So we have to rely on the probity and the scruples of the FBI to present all of this information, including information that would undermine their case. And by the way, it's called the Woods procedure. This is a problem that has plagued the FBI really since the reforms that created the FISA court, because there used to be no process to this. And they have nobody in the Bureau follows it. So it's bigger than just they're not, that there seems to be this double standard when it comes to Republicans, which, by the way, I think there is. And I know I've gotten some heat for that. Because it sounds like a partisan point. I think it's a factual point at this point. Mm-hmm. And if I could, let me just demonstrate why I think, here's how it's a double standard. Because we don't find out about Dianne Feinstein's driver being a Chinese spy until after the issue is resolved. She gets a defensive briefing, she fires him, it's over. So, it's not really a political hit for her. Whereas Matt Gaetz, we are told, there's been leaks, is being investigated for child sex trafficking, and he has yet to be indicted. It's been over a year. Mm-hmm. So we find out a lot of the time about investigations that are ongoing into Republicans, which then cause a massive media feeding frenzy. And then when it's Eric Swalwell or Dianne Feinstein or other Democrats, we don't find out about it until it's over. Now, that to me is a double standard. It's weaponizing the information or the fact of the investigation in order to cast a cloud over someone. And by the way, ironically, this is what, the Hillary Clinton supporters and Hillary Clinton claimed was done to her in 2016. That, James Comey reopens an investigation with less than 2 weeks to go. And by the way, he does clear her 2 days before the election, but still he reopens it. And that just having that out there was enough to sort of cast a cloud and it cost her, the election in a very close year. Well, that's kind of what has been done to Trump and Trump's supporters for the last 6 years. That we get allegations. Oh, it's nuclear secrets at Mar-a-Lago, or anonymous sources say it involves human intelligence or whatever, and everyone's imaginations run wild. And MSNBC, CNN will feature people who are supposed to have a lot of public trust, former intelligence officials, former senior FBI officials, former Justice Department officials, who then go on to sort of speculate these wild scenarios where the president might be selling, secrets to foreign powers or whatever it is, and it's based on nothing. And that's why it might very well be that they really got the goods this time. And if they do, and I see those facts and it's presented in a court of law and he's indicted, I'll believe it, or I will evaluate it then. But I'm not going to go on that. I mean, fool me once, but this would be like fooling me 17 times. It's like, come on.
So tell me, from your perspective, where do things stand with this Mar-a-Lago raid? Things have come out in the past week or so, in terms of additional information. But has anything really come out that has changed your sort of initial reaction to it?
I really need to know more about the nature of this dispute with the National Archive, because we don't know what the information is. All we know is what some of the documents are marked with various levels of classification. Again, I don't know what that means. It could be that Trump has this stuff that wasn't yet declassified that would further vindicate him on Russiagate, which we know he's been obsessed with. I'm not saying that is, it could be that, and then I would view it one way, or it could be, agent lists, in Latin America. What the hell was he doing with that? Or it could be memorabilia from briefings or his presidency, which he wants to one day incorporate into a museum. We cannot know just based on how classified the information is. I'm banging my head against the wall because everybody's writing these stories right now about, the latest on there were 16 boxes and they would have included at least one document that was top secret special compartment. But that doesn't tell us anything. And I'm not, and in addition to all of that, the federal government has a terrible track record of claiming that certain disclosures are going to be, incredibly harmful when they're not. See the Nunes memo. So I'm not saying that I on Twitter, I'm a little looser with it, but I'm not going to go along with it until you show me what everything. And by the way, it's also interesting that it's not clear that they are going to indict Trump, at least based on some of the latest, reporting in the New York Times. And I'm not taking anything away from it's obviously this is a story, and the raid of Mar-a-Lago is a story. But usually you would see that kind of search warrant and then you would see charges filed fairly soon after. The fact that we haven't seen that is to me like another red flag.
How often do we run into that issue where government officials announce that to release some form of information would be incredibly damaging to the country, and then it turns out that it would just be incredibly damaging to them?
They have very little credibility. And there's also this other issue which I've been writing about for years about overclassification. And this is the tendency of the national security bureaucracy to try to want to create more state secrets, and they can't protect all of them, as we've seen, because we have all these massive disclosures. And that's really, if you want to get to the Church Committee, this was in the 1970s, and Senator Frank Church had hearings where he went through a lot of stuff that the CIA and the FBI and the U.S. intelligence community were involved in that they'd kept from the American people. And there were everything from assassination plots to, extraordinary kind of the breadth of the surveillance of American citizens. And this was prompted because there was a lot of unauthorized disclosures in the early 1970s, whether it was the Quakers who broke into an FBI annex in Media, Pennsylvania, or it was what's known as the Family Jewels, which Seymour Hersh published in the New York Times. But there were a series of these kinds of disclosures, and so, Congress really had no choice. They had to kind of get ahead of it. And it would turn out, in my view, traditionally conservatives were very much against the Church Committee. Mm-hmm. But I actually think it had, in some ways, because of the Church Committee, we have the current oversight of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, although they certainly have not really been all-stars recently.
Yeah.
But also the FISA court, again, that's been proven to be less of a protection to civil liberties as we once thought it was. But at least there were some reforms that came out of it. And it seems to me like we have to start thinking through that kind of thing again, because I don't know. I mean, I'd imagine, Ben, that as I read you, and you're probably where I am. There are real threats out there. There are people who want to, there are child sex traffickers and
of course
Russian spies and, Chinese agents. All of that's real. And we want the FBI to be, foiling that and continuing to, investigate organized crime and all the other things that the FBI does. But we can't have that if half the country doesn't think that they have any kind of legitimacy or that they're completely politicized.
Let's go out on this. For your average consumer of media, there is enormous frustration, and I hear it all the time from viewers, that they look at their screens and they see the likes of Brennan and Clapper and Comey and McCabe and Strzok and all of these other people who show up time and again, and many others who are asked to weigh in on these things and treated basically as if they are, they're just experts. They're experts coming in to weigh in with their unbiased opinion about the things that are going on. When, any smart media viewer knows that is not the case. Aren't we reaching a certain point where all of these people, whether they seem to realize it or not, are doing things and saying things that are damaging their own interests, if their interest is to defend the institutions that they were once part of and protect them against some kind of burn it all down or aggressive reform approach?
Yeah, it's sort of and now for a look at the markets, here's Bernie Madoff. It's like
exactly.
At a certain point, especially with Peter Strzok, who, has the rare distinction of being both in charge of the Hillary email investigation and the initial Russiagate investigation. I'm really at a loss, Ben. I don't understand it. I do think it's damaging. And it's not to say they have a right to, and there's obviously an audience for it. So, to a certain extent, people are going to kind of get what they want. But that's the thing, is that if you're going to sort of hold out, as, Brian Stelter recently left CNN, but he was like, we have to hold them accountable. And if you're going to sort of put on this cloak of, I'm not just in it, for the clicks, I'm in it because I believe in journalism, holding people accountable, then you can't have, Andrew McCabe, who, by the way, is the Inspector General. Horowitz found him that he lied repeatedly during an investigation having to do with the leaks of stuff about Hillary Clinton. You can't have Andrew McCabe be a paid contributor to CNN and then simultaneously say, we're just the news guys and we're trying to hold everyone accountable. And we need big national news organizations to be news organization, and just it's not like you can have opinion on that, but you have to also have the ability to sort of say, wait a second, we were told that this was the president was a Russian asset, and it turns out he wasn't a Russian asset. And now we're learning that the Hillary Clinton campaign actually had an open door to the FBI to not only give them the dossier, but to plant these other stories with this white paper having to do with the Alpha Bank, which I thought should have got more attention, to basically kind of gin up investigations into her rival opponent. Well, isn't that what Trump was trying to do in the Ukrainian phone call with Zelensky? You know what I'm saying? It's the same thing. It's I'm going to use my power. Listen, she was out of office at the time, But the idea, and that sort of incestuousness of the institutions where, like, a former FBI lawyer named Sussman, who is working for the Clinton campaign but has an office in an FBI annex and is editing the press release about the Russians hacking the DNC, that stinks to me. Mm-hmm. And it's not okay. And there has to be, like, lines that are drawn, and the media, the press, journalism has to call that out and say, wait a second, that's not okay. This is a scandal too. But we don't have that. And I think it's because that something happened with Trump. He kind of has this ability to turn his opponents, the people who hate him, into versions of him.
Yes,
so
they do everything they accuse him of doing.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm not a Trump fan. I didn't vote for him in 2016. I didn't vote for him in 2020. I think what he did after the election was really awful. So you're not talking, but I'm not in the sense of I'm not like a never Trumper the way, you know, the bulwark is. Yeah. But at the same time, I'm not saying it as like a fan of Trump. I'm just saying you gotta look at this and like you have to have one set of rules for everyone. Mm-hmm. And that's clearly not what we've had. That's what's so frustrating.
Eli Lake, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.